Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's great to see everyone out here tonight. Welcome back from summer break. It's great to see such a large crowd here tonight, so thank you for coming. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the Executive Director of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our September 2023 meeting. As usual, we'll get started with a few announcements. So an education update. We have a busy schedule for our classes coming up here over the next few months. Of course, we'll have our New York evening classes throughout September, and our New York weekend classes on September 16th and the 23rd. And then we're traveling to London. Actually, Brianna Lay, our instructor, is here tonight, and she's going to be making the trip across the pond to London to teach. Hosted by Philips in partnership with the British Horological Institute and the Museum of Timekeeping. So if you have any friends in London, and you might want to let them know we're coming their way soon. Then we're headed to Los Angeles for classes on October 20th and 21st, hosted by F.P. Jorn. And then San Francisco, November 4th and 5th, hosted by Shreve & Co., and then again with our friends at F.P. Jorn in Miami, November 18th and 19th. So a busy schedule. We look forward to seeing everyone out at our classes soon. And our summer survey, I was thinking about this today. Culturally, summer is over, right? Labor Day is a thing of the past, but technically we kind of still... We still are in summer for a few more weeks here. So we have our summer survey still online through September 23rd. And if you could please take a few moments to answer some questions in our survey, it helps us quite a bit with future planning. And the survey is online. You can access it easily at that URL, hs-ny.org/survey. And I'd like to give a quick advertisement for an incredible exhibition that we have upstairs on the 5th floor at the HSNY Library. It's called Pocket Genius, the watch collection of Alex Koo. And it's just the most incredible collection of pocket watches that I've ever seen in one place. If you have a chance, I highly recommend to check it out. And we have this amazing catalog that goes along with the exhibition, and it was put together by Miranda and Carolina, our deputy director and librarian, and they did an amazing job with this catalog. So when you get a chance, please check it out. All right, so now on to tonight's lecture. All right, so I get a question for the audience, and a question for myself, I guess. What do we all think of when you hear the term historical American horology? Or maybe historical American watchmakers? I can tell you what I think of first. I think of the major manufacturers, probably what the U.S. is most famous for are big brands like Hamilton, Bulova, Elgin, Waltham, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. But what about American independent watchmakers? Right? That's a little bit more of a difficult subject to get into. But there are independent watchmakers that are here in the U.S., both right now in modern times and historically. So I think of Roland Murphy. I think of Josh Shapiro. And we can go backwards in time a bit. I think of Gene Clark. Who here knows Gene Clark? If you haven't heard of Gene Clark, you have to look him up. I think of Charles Fazolt, going back in time even further. And if we go back all the way to the Colonial era, there was Robert Leslie. So there's a fascinating history of American watchmaking from an independent maker's perspective that has yet to be uncovered, that's in the process of being uncovered. And tonight we're going to take a deep dive into the life and work of Robert Leslie and the incredible work that he did in the colonial era in Philadelphia. So tonight we're very lucky to have an expert on the subject with us. He is the Chair Emeritus and a Fellow of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. He's also a Freeman at the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in London. If you could all please join me in welcoming Mr. Richard Newman.
Well, thanks, Nick, for inviting me here tonight. It's really an honor to be with the Horological Society of New York and talk about this subject that is pretty dear to my heart. And I hope you'll also be dear to your heart at the end of about 45-minute talk. Before I get into Robert Leslie, I'm going to talk a little bit about the business of watch and clock making during the time frame that we're talking about. So, you know, obviously the vast majority of watches and clocks that were sold in America were imported from Europe, primarily England, and they bear the name of an English maker and a serial number. And that maker could have been a maker, but most likely was a retailer. And timepieces that were engraved London or Paris were especially regarded for the high reputation that watch and clock making had there. So it really portrayed the highest quality as well as the highest fashion of the day. And keeping up with the Joneses, just like today with brands, was equally important hundreds of years ago. Fashion has always been important. However, a few early American makers offered their own line of clock and watches that were likely sold for less money or came with longer guarantees, and they appealed to patriotic Americans as well as others who wanted to do business with the name that was engraved directly on the watch or the clock. So retailers in America who had the right connections to England were able to order clocks and watches in a finished state, complete and ready to sell with their names already on these clocks and watches. And this follows the same practice that was going on in Europe at the time, exactly the same. That said, very few actual colonial era American signed watches are known. I've been tracking them for about 30 years, and I've come up with about 20. This early watch is signed Samuel Bagnall, Boston, and was made and imported from England, probably right around 1740. And this is the earliest American watch known. It's New York, and it's signed by John Wright, who emigrated from Compton, a small town very near in the vicinity to Liverpool, over 300 years ago. It features a fabulous automation sun and moon dial, and was likely finished and sold by John Wright way back in about 1715 to perhaps 1720. It must have been made for a very wealthy merchant or perhaps official of the crown, because something like this was the highest tech and frankly the most expensive consumer good that one could ever imagine seeing during the day. Pure magic. And here is a much later example from Thomas Parker of Philadelphia, a Revolutionary era watch on the left from about 1777, imported. Next to it, a Parker signed clock, courtesy of the National Watch and Clock Museum in Columbia, Pennsylvania, that appears to be made and cased locally in Philadelphia. No doubt there was a large trade of imported clocks and watches taking place, especially towards the end of the 18th century, when competition reduced prices and the growing middle class in America, just like in England, really drove demand. But we also know that small-scale clock and watchmaking was also taking place throughout much of the century. There we go. Both clock and watchmakers were able to import rough movements called eboshes or frames or kits, and finish them locally. A few pocket watch examples are on this slide, and they all date to around the end of the 19th century. Very few of these also survive. Thomas Harlan made watches in Connecticut. John Carnes made watches in Providence. Wheelock and Morse in Massachusetts. And of course, Luther Goddard was the first to mass produce pocket watches in America in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, right after the start of the 1800s. Others advertised that they also finished watches on their premises. For some, it may have been more of a promotional venture or bragging rights meant to attract customers to their shop, where their bread and butter may have been selling imported clocks and watches, and of course, servicing and repairing them. Servicing and repair was always a very large part of clock and watchmaking business back then. So why would a maker finish rough kits or eboshes when one could buy ready-to-sell finished timepieces with your name already engraved on it? Well, you can bet it was motivated by profit, pride, marketing, availability of imports, or other environmental conditions. However, when I think about innovation in timekeeping, very few American names come to mind. Today, I'm going to talk about a clockmaker, watchmaker, and inventor, Robert Leslie. Robert Leslie's story was lost to history until this watch showed up at a rural Virginia swap meet in 2012 and was snatched up by a collector with a keen eye for the unusual. He then showed it to me at an NAWCC educational event. I tell you, I knew the name. I knew who this was. I didn't have a clue back then what it was or the fun that was before me to try to figure it out. I'm sure many of you will recognize immediately Thomas Jefferson's famous Monticello Plantation home in Virginia, and it has a two-sided clock at the entrance. This clock is known as the Great Clock, and it was in fact a Robert Leslie commission in 1793, but it was actually made by one of his journeymen, a man named Peter Spruck, to Thomas Jefferson's design, which, as it turns out, wasn't a very good design, but that's perhaps a story for another day. But the Great Clock isn't the only commission that Thomas Jefferson trusted to Robert Leslie. Many letters survive between these two men, and they reference timepieces in addition to this Great Clock that Leslie made for Jefferson. That includes an odometer for his horse-drawn carriage, a pocket watch, and an interesting reference to a quote-unquote small balance clock that has a skeleton frame. Leslie also made a clock intended for George Washington, which is documented in one of the letters between Robert Leslie and George Washington, and we'll be discussing that clock a little bit later. So scholars and collectors are most familiar with Robert Leslie through the name of the firm Leslie and Price, a firm that was operating in Philadelphia in the 1790s. It was actually formed in 1793. Price is Isaac Price, a fellow Philadelphia maker. And before you are some of the common watches that they sold, imported from London, all of them engraved Philadelphia. But there's much more to the story, as we will see. So this is the trade card for the Philadelphia firm Leslie and Price. And although a bit difficult to make out, each clock dial in the background is written Leslie's patent. And notice in the foreground, that Father Time is giving a watch to Neptune, which illustrates all too well one of Robert Leslie's passions, which was timekeeping at sea. So this is just a quick shot of downtown Philadelphia with the location of the Leslie and Price shop on Market Street, which was conveniently very close to the wharfs. where imported goods of all kinds were arriving from Europe. I often refer to Leslie as the greatest American maker ever forgotten, because his contributions as a watch and clock maker and inventor eluded collectors and scholars for nearly 250 years. Why? Well, first and most importantly, Robert Leslie is recorded in all the reference books as a Scotsman who comes to Philadelphia from London. He's outed by the Philadelphia Guild as being unqualified and having spurious inventions, and sent packing back to London. Well, nothing could be further than the truth. In fact, he was American, born in rural Maryland in 1765, but as a wrongly documented maker from Britain, he was completely skipped over by American horologists and researchers interested in American history and American horology. Secondly, in 1836, in Washington, D.C., long after Leslie is dead, there's a devastating fire in the patent office. That fire in 1836 destroys almost every early colonial patent in America. I'm afraid Leslie's patents, which were extensive, went up in smoke just like the rest of them. They're just gone. And lastly, although a number of watches and clocks are signed by the Philadelphia firm Leslie and Price, as I already showed, none of the clocks or pocket watches that he made for Thomas Jefferson, except for the Monticello Great Clock, or Leslie's inventions, his patented inventions, survived, or so we thought before that watch showed up at that rural swap meet in Virginia. So here's a close-up of the area. Leslie was exposed to shipping along the Elk River and helped in the local blacksmith shop as the Revolutionary War was first breaking out. He also frequented a gold and silversmith shop and no doubt other interesting shops along the river that supported commerce. The Elk is a tributary of the Chesapeake, and it's really strategic. So this is where Howe landed 18,000 troops at Brandywine, and then went on to capture Philadelphia in 1777. Leslie would have lived this history as a 12-year-old boy. Kids grew up fast in those days. At age 18, after both his parents are dead, he left, hoping to find work with a clockmaker. But without a formal apprenticeship or a formal education, he could not find employment in the trade. As we will see, the relationship he had with the Philadelphia Guild years later was really not good, and perhaps his difficulty finding employment as a young lad really planted his disdain for the power and control that guilds and the apprenticeship system had at the time. Anyway, Leslie was eventually able to get a job with a maker in Delaware. And then he opened his own silversmith shop back again in Elkton, Maryland, along the Elk River. 3 years later, he moved to Philadelphia. He worked for another maker, Thomas Morgan, for a while, and then he opened up his own shop. Leslie is married. It's now 1787, and he's about 22 years old. So here we have a mechanical genius from rural Maryland trying to earn a living and thrive in the bustling atmosphere of Philadelphia, the new nation's capital, just as Philadelphia was gaining a worldwide reputation for scientific research and achievement. It must have been Disneyland on steroids for someone with Leslie's intellect, and provided fertile ground for his growing interests, not only in clock and watchmaking, but in other topics. And he communicated with statesmen and scholars from all the sciences, all of whom were working to form the pillars of the new government, from standardizing weights and measures to commerce, defense, coinage, everything that a new nation needs to prosper and compete with the rest of the Western world. 3 years later, 3 years later, Leslie was hired to do work on the Pennsylvania-Philadelphia State House clock. This is the marvelous tower clock that was made in 1753 by Peter Stretch. He took the job from a guild member, Griffith Owen. A commission going to a non-guild member likely didn't sit well with the Philadelphia Guild, especially since in their eyes, Leslie was unqualified. And I'm sure the disdain was mutual. As I mentioned, Leslie had nothing to do with the Guild for the rest of his life. But he slowly built a reputation for his ideas and inventions over the next several years, and his interests were really extensive. He corresponded with some of the most celebrated figures in America, including Benjamin Rittenhouse, Ben Franklin, and John Fitch. Robert Leslie's first advertisement appeared in 1787, only 1 year after he arrived in Philadelphia. This small piece of self-promotion highlights an invention for clocks, quote, on a new and improved plan that is not subject to any visible variation from the different changes of weather, is now in possession of the inventor and maker, and may be seen at his shop on the west side of Front Street. And it goes on to say, any person having clocks or timepieces of any kind, going with either weight, spring, pendulum, or balance, may have the above additional improvement annexed to it at a small expense. So makers, of course, serviced and repaired, and that was a big part of all of their businesses. But this is something quite different. Leslie is saying, bring me your clock, and I'll add my invention to it to make it run better. I think he's talking about one of his inventions, the torsion pendulum. And he's replacing the traditional back and forth pendulum and putting it in its place. Here's just a couple of photographs of typical torsion pendulum clocks. They all go back to Robert Leslie's concepts nearly 250 years ago. On the left, a couple of typical 400-day, sometimes called anniversary clocks, sold by the millions and still available today. On the right, a couple desirable antique pieces made by Aaron Crane in the middle of the 19th century. While no federal laws for issuing patents existed in America at this time, colonial assemblies granted individuals exclusive rights to make and sell their inventions. And that's exactly the course that Robert Leslie pursued next. And here's the public notice for Leslie's patent applications. It reads, an act to grant and secure to Robert Leslie for a limited time the sole and exclusive right and benefit of constructing, making, and selling within this Commonwealth the improvements of him lately invented on clocks and watches, the Commonwealth being the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Leslie's patent application was passed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and this is again before any federal patent laws existed in our country. They were signed by none other than George Washington himself. Here's an extract of that notice that I'll just quickly review. It talks about 3 methods of pendulum construction, possibly related to his torsion pendulum invention. That's what I think. Also, a new escapement for clocks, a new escapement for verge watches, and then 2 inventions where he uses the term balance wheel, and lastly, something called a cycloid curb for the balance. Now, we simply do not know what these inventions specified because, as I mentioned, the Patent Office fire in 1836 destroyed all of his records. That would have included his drawings, and back in those days, they made models, all of which are gone. But not wasting any time and always the promoter when opportunity arises, Leslie advertises his quote-unquote superior inventions and states that he hopes to receive the patronage of those who prefer a superior article to an inferior one when both are being sold at the same price. Well, you can imagine that that also didn't go down very well with the Philadelphia Guild. Leslie has just basically stated that other clock and watchmakers are selling inferior products and they cost too much. Well, the Guild at the time is headed by John Wood Jr., and this long-simmering feud finally comes to a head, and the Guild exerts its power. Leslie is blackballed, as is his friend Isaac Price, and that basically means that they're no longer able to get any materials or supplies from any of the workers in Philadelphia, none of the wholesalers. It also means that they can't hire any apprentices or journeymen to work for them, because whoever works for them is never going to find employment with another watch and clock maker in Philadelphia because of the Guild. Well, clearly the Guild felt undermined by this newcomer, and the blacklisting is well documented in the newspapers at the time, the first of which was published in 1790. Well, in response to ensuing attacks on Leslie's character that described him as not properly trained in clock and watchmaking, Leslie cites envy, and he retorts that John Wood was content, quote, trudging on in the old beaten path of cleaning and stopping up pivot holes. In other words, he, like most clock and watchmakers, are happy just doing retailing and making repairs and not doing anything to advance the technology or science of clock or watchmaking. No doubt grievances by both makers have a measure of merit. Leslie was an imaginative inventor, skilled mechanic, but he never went through a formal apprenticeship. However, Leslie defended his inventions by pointing out that Henry Voigt and David Rittenhouse, two of the most respected makers in all of America, spoke favorably about his clock pendulum, again, likely his torsion pendulum. And further, Benjamin Rittenhouse was among the clock and watchmakers that were represented on the patent commission that awarded Leslie his first patents. But without the ability to hire apprentices or journeymen or to procure materials, it seems that Robert Leslie was seemingly finished in Philadelphia. However, his intended demise proved to be a bit premature. He persevered, and he continued to enhance clocks and watches with his improved inventions. And then a little later, in 1791, he again announces that he has new inventions, this time for repeating striking that he applies to both clocks and watches for significantly less money than commonly charged for similar work. There's just no surviving records to know that how many clocks and watches were made or fitted with any of Leslie's inventions. However, John Perry, who's actually the nephew of David Rittenhouse and had a very good business in Philadelphia, takes out an advertisement advertising himself as a clock and watchmaker, and he also states that he applies Mr. Leslie's patent verge to common watches. So we know at least one of Leslie's inventions, his new watch escapement, was licensed and apparently being applied to watches in Philadelphia. This is the early 1790s. When Congress finally passed the first federal patent acts, Leslie is granted 5, and 3 are related to clocks and watches. They're labeled pendulum double for ships, pendulum clocks, and pendulum double. All that's left, by the way, are these high-level titles. As I mentioned, everything else is burned up. But we do know with a high degree of certainty that Robert Leslie was actually the first American to get clock patents in America. He's also the first American to get watch patents in America. And this is years before men like Eli Terry, who are credited with getting the first clock patents, actually took place. This advertisement in 1792 announces the partnership Leslie and Price, but more remarkably, their attempt to manufacture Leslie's patents out of London, where labor, materials, and expertise was readily available. Leslie is relocating to London. Remember I mentioned earlier on that he was known theoretically as an English maker, comes to America, is outed in the guild, goes packing back to London. He didn't go packing back to London. He wants to go back to London for the first time. He's going to make his patented inventions there. The firm Leslie and Price is doing something that nobody I know of in early America has done before. Leslie is flipping the importation model on its head. They're putting their own man, Robert Leslie, in London to act as the middleman. They're therefore able to personally manage the quality, quantity, features, and complications that would best appeal to their customers back home in Philadelphia. Leslie carries with him letters of introduction from Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who refers to him as one of the most ingenious mechanics he has ever known. Surviving Jefferson letters also state that Leslie is carrying with him on this voyage 2 different constructions of marine clocks that he has made and he intends to test. Were these torsion pendulum clocks or balance clocks? We just simply don't know. But Leslie arrives in London in 1793 and writes only a few months later to Charles Wilson Peel, the famous soldier, painter, and politician, and he states, "My little timepiece with the circular pendulum I have now going as well as any clock in London." He also writes to Thomas Jefferson that he's taking out patents in England with his new partner in London, the very well-established maker, Joseph Dodds. And they're working as fast as possible and hope to be able to have something clever next year, which would have been 1794. Leslie later writes that 4 watches with his watch escapement and invention have already been sold to sea captains, and additional orders are pending. It seems that the something clever and these 4 watches sold to sea captains were examples of Leslie's nautical watch, the watch design that turned up in Virginia in 2012. And the watch that started this fabulous research journey for me. Well, as you can imagine, Robert Leslie was really a driven man. He was in London for 6 years, starting in 1793. Within 1 year of leaving Philadelphia, he's retailing watches, clocks, and fancy goods from the shop in London, exporting clocks and watches to his primary location, Leslie and Price, the shop in Philadelphia, and his English patents are approved. This also happens in 1793, the year of his arrival. So we can be confident that these were his ideas that he brought with him from Philadelphia. Some very likely first put to paper with the George Washington signed American patents that convinced one of the major retailers in London, Joseph Dodds, to become his financial sponsor and partner. Ironically, when John Wood Jr. passes away in Philadelphia, his firm, Leslie and Price, emerges as one of the dominant clock and watchmaking firms in the city. So much so that they expand to Baltimore 2 years later, in 1795, run by Abraham Patten and Samuel G. Jones. While Robert Leslie's patents in America were all destroyed in 1836, his English patents, dated 1793, thankfully survive. And here they are, laid out on a table at the British Library in London. Described in the patent as improvement or improvements on clocks, watches, and other timekeepers used either at sea or on land, they show 12 clock and watch inventions, and it evidenced that Leslie was working on some of the most challenging timekeeping problems of the day. I'm just going to highlight a few of Leslie's more interesting and practical patents, but first I want to give a big thanks to the well-known horologist Jonathan Betts, Rory McAvoy, and Philip Ponish for their technical observations and research assistance in doing this work. So the first specification, not surprising, is Leslie's diagram of a torsion pendulum. As discussed already, he worked extensively on these concepts for many years. This next patent is a spring pallet constant force escapement for clocks that uses springs to provide the impulse. So the purpose of a constant force escapement is to make the power reaching the escapement consistent as the clock winds down. And this was a challenge that the best of the best were working on in England and France and Switzerland also at the time. Next, we have a constant force escapement for watches. It apparently predates the work of Breguet, and therefore should be quite interesting, if not a bit controversial, to horologists and collectors abroad, and hopefully that happens soon as details of Leslie's work gets published abroad. This specification by Leslie is apparently the first patent for winding a watch by the stem instead of using a key. The action of pressing the stem down and pulling it back up again winds the mainspring. It's reported that Swiss makers Lepine and Droz made winding mechanisms on similar principles, and no doubt Leslie's connections with the Swiss may have happened through his partner in London, Joseph Dodds, who is known to retail some of the most expensive Swiss-made watches in his high-end shop. And this is very likely the watch escapement that Leslie invented in Philadelphia way back in 1789. Regardless whether then or the 1793 repatent, it seems that America's first unquote, quote, chronometer maker, at least commensurate with the definition at that time, was Robert Leslie. Although it is not a detent design, it's described in Rupert Gould's famous book on marine chronometers, first published in 1923. Gould's illustration in his book is on the right, and on the left is Leslie's patent. But I also want to draw your attention to the diagram that sits directly above. This is Leslie's nautical watch. The patent describes a new watch train layout with a going barrel, no fusee, and it's the first documented watch movement designed by an American. The dial with dual time zones is apparently also the first captain's watch. At least I can't find an example that predates his patent. It shows the time in 2 different time zones and is of course still being used on wristwatches that are made today. We know from Leslie's surviving correspondence and publications that the movement train layout was designed to accommodate different escapements, including his free balance chronometer escapement, his keyless pendant wind invention, as well as additional dials like a tide dial. And the purpose was to aid navigation at sea. So let's be clear. Leslie's nautical watch was not intended for expeditions of the East India Company or the Royal Navy or anything of the sort. His target market was surely the merchant shipping captains who made their trade between England and the continent and to America. They couldn't afford much more than a Virgin fusee watch. This was one step better. I think it's also the quote-unquote something special that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson and his other friends about. Leslie advertises the nautical watch in Philadelphia papers in 1794, stating that serial number 1 is at his Philadelphia shop. Always the promoter, Robert Leslie touts, respectable scientific men in London say that it exceeds every other kind for convenience, utility, and simplicity of construction. Well, apparently serial number 1 hasn't survived, but at least 2 other examples have. This is the one that was discovered in 2012. Part of Robert Leslie's inventive genius as physically configured on this watch was bringing together marketing, design, and early manufacturing principles into a single concept, his nautical watch. Notice that this movement was configured with 4 different styles of hands. This is all original. And the winding arbor protrudes both through the dial as well as the back of the watch and actually through the dust cap. I think this is all ingenious marketing by Robert Leslie years before its time to show the customer the various ways in which this watch could be ordered and then made by him in London. The winding options are designed to appeal to continental style customers who preferred winding through the dial, as well as English style preferred, who liked winding the watch through the back. And there's, interestingly, also a slot cut in this movement with 2 tapped screws on either side. So this e-Bosch was made to also have Leslie's patented stem wind if the customer wanted it. If ordered, the same frame, the same e-Bosch, the same standardized frame could be used to manufacture it. Whoops. So this is the signature plate that's highlighted with 2 screws, easily applied, and it shows that Leslie had multiple markets in mind. Of course, he had shops in London as well as in America, and it just confirms sort of his thinking about the manufacturing process. This could have been done as a last step. Just apply the signature plate and ship it out. This is a complete watch, running, ready to be cased, but it never was cased. To me, it's kind of a salesman's sample that Leslie shipped to Philadelphia to generate orders that would, as I said, would be passed back to him in London to be manufactured. Just brilliant manufacturing. But by the greatest of luck, a second nautical watch, signed by Leslie's partner Joseph Dodds, was rediscovered just a few years ago at the Russell Coates Art Gallery and Museum in Bournemouth, England. It is thankfully configured with Leslie's patented escapement, the chronometer escapement that Gould called a free balance escapement, and it's put running again. The Bournemouth nautical watch movement was featured, by the way, in an AHS Journal article last fall that was authored by Jonathan Betts and the individual that found this watch, Dale Sarderson. Well, unfortunately for Dodds and Leslie, it seems that these inventions did not reap the financial rewards that they were looking for, and their partnership either goes stale or dormant after a few years. But while commercially unsuccessful in the 18th century, this escapement concept reappeared generations later, tried by others, also unsuccessfully. But let's back up a moment to Thomas Jefferson and Leslie's clocks. We know Leslie made a balance clock in Philadelphia with a skeleton frame for Jefferson before coming to London in 1793. We also know from Jefferson's own hand that Leslie made several clocks to test out on his voyage to London. So there's no doubt that a number of clocks were made by Robert Leslie. And then there's this intriguing letter to George Washington. Upon arriving in London, Leslie writes that he plans to stay for 3 or 4 years, intends to work on weights and measures that he hopes Congress would fund so he could earn some money at it. And that letter also states that he has with him the clock and pendulum that he proposed for George Washington. So what happened to Washington's clock? Well, it survives. Sort of hiding in plain sight, as they say. One of the most historic American clocks in existence. Washington scholars will recall that one of the several physicians present when George Washington died was Dr. Eliza Dick. He was a fellow freeman in lodge number 22 in Alexandria, Virginia. That's the lodge where Washington was the master. And when Washington passed away the night of December 14th in 1799, the Masons recount that the doctor turned to the chamber clock that was sitting there with Washington, and he cut the cord to forever mark the time, 10:20 p.m. This clock is in the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Alexandria. As the name implies, it's really a wonderful place, a national memorial. And still to this day, it's Masonic Lodge number 22. The lodge also houses a museum dedicated to George Washington, its one-time master. And you could see in this slide what caught my attention many, many years ago, when by chance I had a bit of free time on a business trip, and I climbed the steep hill just outside of the old town of Alexandria to take a look and see what was in this museum. Okay, so I think early horologists that read that Washington's death was preserved for all time by cutting the cord dismissed it, frankly, as folklore. After all, English shelf clocks were powered by very powerful springs. And if you cut that fusee gut cord, that movement would explode. There'd be wheels going everywhere, and it would likely take a few pieces of the doctor's fingers with him. Shown on the left on this slide is Washington's clock. On the right, just a photo of a typical English shelf clock of the period, and at a glance you could see that they're pretty darn similar. But this is not English, not the movement, not the case, not the design, not the construction, not by a long shot. I think this is Robert Leslie. And I think this is the clock that he writes to George Washington about in 1794, the quote-unquote clock with pendulum that I propose to you. You are seeing yet to be published details of this movement, courtesy of the Alexandria Washington Lodge number 22 and its archivist, Stephen Stewart. So again, on the left, Washington's crazy clock movement. On the right, a typical English movement with a typical English pendulum. This movement design is absolutely unique in the world of clockmaking. A one-wheel, compound weight, compound balance, pendulum, shelf clock. The photo illustration on the left shows the compound weight, so you can see how it was likely hung and how it powered the movement. The actual weight, with its small integral pulley, cast in lead, is on the right. With a penny next to it, you could see how small it is. And the clock pendulum is above, a perfect timepiece for a bed chamber. Time only and quiet. Well, well, well. I guess the doctor did cut the weight to preserve Washington's death for all eternity. This clock is intriguing in so many ways. Here's the escapement at the bottom of the one-wheel clock. And these photographs show the lever on the left with the balance pendulum slightly raised off of its nice knife edge to expose the notch. And the pendulum, looking at the illustration on the right, sits into the lever. And the banking pins, highlighted with arrows, limits the travel from left to right and back again, similar to technology concepts in lever watch escapements years later. We're looking at an American designed and made presidential colonial clock, most likely made by Robert Leslie. Of course, touching this national treasure is impossible, so we may never know if there are additional clues or components that we can't readily see. I could tell you I was just ecstatic and immensely grateful to be able to be in the same room with this clock and document its construction for really the first time. It still points to 10:20, the time of Washington's death. But what I can do, using a bit of photographic manipulation, is to give you an idea, to simulate the travel of this slow beat compound balance pendulum. So what the heck happened to Robert Leslie? We can surmise that the partnership and sponsorship of Joseph Dodds didn't last probably not more than a couple of years. Clearly, fame and fortune didn't happen. We do know that his partner, Isaac Price in Philadelphia, their flagship shop, and likely their primary source of income, dies of yellow fever in 1798. It takes the better part of a year for the news to reach him and for Leslie to decide what to do about it. Apparently the books back in Philadelphia are a mess, and he has no choice but to leave and go back home to Philadelphia. He takes off on September 18th of 1799. He's on an American armed merchant ship, and this is at a time when the undeclared quasi-wars are taking place between England and France, and American shipping is getting caught up in it. Their ship is attacked by a French frigate, and a long battle ensues. It ends in a standoff, and they have to limp into Lisbon to conduct repairs. Leslie's business is going down the tubes, and he and the family, a wife, 5 kids, they're stuck in Lisbon, not knowing the uncertain situation awaiting for them back in Philadelphia. His expectations of arriving home in 3 to 4 weeks go out the window. It's now approaching winter, and shipping mostly stops. You just can't make this stuff up. 8 months later, May 11th, 1800, they finally arrive in Philadelphia. Everything is gone. He tries to pick up the pieces and forms a partnership with John Perry, the man I mentioned earlier, the maker, the nephew of David Rittenhouse. Leslie's last letter to Thomas Jefferson is dated a little over 2 years later, in 1803. And he talks about how cheaply made watches are flooding the markets in America. So much so that watch and clock makers are having real difficulty just to earn a living. He also tells Jefferson that he has retired because he's lost the use of his left hand due to what he calls a rheumatic complaint in the wrist and the shoulder that he's been struggling with for several years, perhaps a minor stroke. Leslie writes to Jefferson, and I'll quote this, "My situation may therefore be described in few words. A man with a wife and 5 children to maintain, with 1 hand and 1 head, neither of them worth much. The head stuffed full of once he thought was useful information, collected in various places and at great expense during the last 15 years, but which is now of so little value, it would not purchase a beefsteak or a loaf of bread in the market." He dies later that year. I figure he was about 38 years old. Robert Leslie's story is truly an American tale, just waiting for Martin Scorsese or perhaps Quentin Tarantino to make it into a movie. He came from humble beginnings, yet approached the world with tremendous conviction and in a manner that was truly revolutionary for the time. He was a persistent inventor. He received the first watch and clock patents in America, and he made clocks and watches for Thomas Jefferson, and almost certainly Washington's deathbed chamber clock, one of America's most historic clocks. Although he suffered from poor health and he died relatively young, he significantly contributed to the field of clock and watchmaking long after he was dead. Geez, not bad for a self-taught maker who was nearly run out of Philadelphia. It gives me really great pleasure to share with you tonight just some of Robert Leslie's story, no longer forgotten, Let's all help give this man his rightful place in American history. Thank you very much.
Incredible. Thank you. All right, thank you, everyone. Now we'll get to our Q&A section of the evening. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone to you. Let's get the other microphone out here as well. Here, I'll take that. All right, any questions? We'll go here to the front.
You touched very, I'm sorry, this is how it's working. You touched very briefly on American clockmakers of the, I guess, the last century or so. Where does Seth Thomas, or does he at all, or is he a real person, fit in?
Well, Seth Thomas is the apprentice to Eli Terry in the early 1800s. Eli Terry, of course, is the first maker, actually anywhere, to apply manufacturing techniques and sort of develop what turns out to really be standards in manufacturing with completely interchangeable parts, and in a manner where a clockmaker didn't have to be involved in making clocks absolutely interchangeable. So Eli Terry is really a great figure, and that happens in the early 1800s. Seth Thomas is his apprentice, if you will, and then goes off on his own business to manufacture basically clocks in Connecticut throughout the first half of the 1800s. So it's really quite a bit later.
We have a question back here.
Thank you very much. I was curious, could you talk a little bit about your research process, or how kind of you went about discovering all these things and your journey doing that from when you first saw that timepiece?
Yeah, thanks very much for your question. You know, there's so many horologists, scholars, collectors. They think that everything has been researched, you know, and there's nothing more to do. I can tell you here tonight, the fact of the matter is almost no research has been done. And the research that has been done has happened so long ago, before so many publications have become available on the internet, that they really need to be rethought and redone. So there's plenty of opportunity for anyone out there who is interested in doing research. The one thing that I learned is you never let a tentacle go away, meaning you make as many contacts as you can, and you keep, you know, you just have to keep those warm. And basically through hunting, one finds little tidbits of information through genealogy research, you know, as well as the patents and the like. And interestingly enough, in many of the early horological books, they talk about Robert Leslie, again, coming from London, which was false. But they basically state, we don't know this man's place. Was he an inventor? Was he a charlatan? Was he English? You know, what's this partnership with John Perry in 1802? You know, so there's pieces out there. And when you find those pieces, you know there's primary source material. Then you need to find the primary source material and work it from there.
Other questions? All right, we'll go here.
It appears that he was active in England at a time where there were a lot of well-known and well-regarded watchmakers. Maybe not in England, but Pierre-Jacques Dreux or like you mentioned, Breguet, also William Harrison. Is there any indication that he had any kind of overlap or correspondence with any of these individuals?
There is not. There's more to uncover in this story. His partner, though, Joseph Dodds, was a well-known high-end retailer. And actually, there's a clock in the famous collection at the Belmont House, which is outside of London, that has a clock that's marked King's Patent. It's Robert Leslie. And it's signed Joseph Dodds. Unfortunately, it appears the escapement has been switched out. And maybe it originally had the clock constant force escapement. Who knows? Over the years, so many of these things don't work as intended, but most importantly, unfortunately, repairers do what they know. They just rip this stuff out and put back a conventional escapement.
We have a question here in the back of the room.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. My question was, do you know if anyone has ever tried to make a replica of George Washington's clock to test the theory?
That's a great question. No one has made a replica of the clock. We're actually looking into perhaps doing that through probably the NAWCC or other nonprofit horological organization, so that it could be studied but not commercialized. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's a fascinating movement to make.
We have a question here in the front of the room.
First off, thank you for sharing a remarkable story that you're bringing to light. But you talk about, and I think we would all not be sitting here today if that swap meet didn't happen, right? And if you didn't find that, so that's pretty interesting. But I don't think you talked about where this watch has been for 200 years between when it turned up and when it was made. I was wondering if you had any information on that.
No idea where it was before it showed up, the nautical watch showed up at that Virginia swap meet. But interestingly, the second nautical watch that was found in Bournemouth in a museum, which is just the escape, is just the movement, no case, just the movement, also has been sitting there for who knows how long, in a drawer of movements, something interesting thrown in the back of the drawer. So one thing that's wonderful about doing research is you hope that others, collectors, scholars, curators, they also read some of this stuff, and they end up thinking to themselves, I think I saw something like that once. That's the fun part. It sort of rolls on, and then you get more information, you help collaborate and try to fill in the holes. And believe me, with Robert Leslie, there are a lot of holes.
Any other questions? Two here in the front. I've got a quick question for you. You showed a page of the Rupert Gould book, Marine Chronometers, and he drew one of Leslie's escapements. It looked like he drew a cylinder escapement, and it looked completely different than what was on the patent that you shown before with the chronometer style escapement. Was that just a complete mistake by Gould?
No, that's actually Leslie's escapement. It is the specification in the patent.
Okay, all right.
And interestingly, so Rupert Gould, as I said, this book's published in the early 1900s. That escapement patent was known and found in London, but just not attributed to an American.
All right, we had two questions here in the front.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is, how come, or rather, do we know why Robert Leslie did not establish a stronger foothold in London and was so dependent on business from back home?
I just think the competition is so high, and his real bread and butter was exporting to his locations in America, Philadelphia and Baltimore. So when his partner passes away in 1798, back then the logistics, the insurance, the risks, and all these things took forever and a day. He has a shop on Oxford Street, and it's kind of fun to think that there's clocks and watches signed Robert Leslie London. We know them. They're out there. And it's a Colonial maker. It's not an Englishman. And they're sitting in English collections somewhere in England. I hope I answered your question. We just really don't know the commerce that was going on at the time. But he's in Clerkenwell, right in the middle of where all the, the watchmaking, clockmaking activities were taking place. I assume he was pretty well integrated in with the manufacturing process, and so much of that dealt with the exportation to, what I think became the wealthiest and most receptive market to new things. That was America. Many of the most early English lever watches, early in the 1800s and the like, a lot of those came to America. The whaling, the fishing, slave trade, other things that were happening along the eastern seaboard generated a ton of wealth. Charleston, all the way up to Boston. Wonderful market.
All right, do we have one other question?
Maybe one more question.
One more?
Thank you. That was a lovely lecture. My question is, you mentioned, or Leslie mentioned in his letter to Thomas Jefferson, a flood of cheap watches coming in, being imported in. Where were those watches coming from? Those cheap
Right.
watches.
So these are Virgin Fusee watches. Most of them are coming from England. In fact, many of them have pseudonames on them meant to appeal to a name for an American, sort of like a brand, if you will, engraved on the back of the watch. When we think about all of these watches coming in, and you look at many watches for sale on the internet or other marts and antique shows going on, largely you're seeing better quality watches because they've survived. A ton of cheap stuff was coming in as well. They just wore out quickly. They didn't survive. They were tossed. So, we're at a period in the, right around 1800 or so, where the money to be made through the exportation of watches, is just tremendous. And you get to the point where it doesn't pay to even repair these watches because the quality is so poor. And one can find many advertisements in America that talk about the poor quality of watches, and this is why you, my customer, should buy a watch from an American maker or an American retailer, someone that had their name on the watch itself. But even then, when we look at all the records, only about 1 or 2% of all the watches that one can find in early account books are actually signed by an American retailer or maker. 98% coming from Europe.
All right, let's give Rich another hand. Thank you for the incredible lecture. All right, thank you everyone for coming out. If you want to come up and speak with Mr. Newman, he's here for you, and we'll see you all next month. Have a great night.